Dr. Dan Siegel, welcome back to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me.
Well, we last spoke in 2011, 5 years ago, about your book, Mindsight. And it's great to be able to speak to you again about your latest book. I have to say, you have really been busy over the past 5 years. You've written several books and spoken tons of places and so on.
Yes, it's been a busy couple of years, a wonderful couple of years for sure.
Yeah, that's excellent. Well, your latest book, which we're going to be discussing, and I'm holding it up now for the camera, for anybody who's watching on camera, is titled Mind, A Journey to the Heart of Being Human.
Yes.
That's a modest project, I must say.
Yeah. Well, it was an exciting book to write. And, the idea of a journey is that we all have our journeys that we're on. And this is just one particular journey. But it's also an invitation for the reader to go on a journey also into what the heart of being human means for her or for him as we go together on this path to explore the mind.
Yeah. And, you're brave to tackle this topic because mind is not a little topic. It's a concept that philosophers and now scientists have struggled with for millennia.
It's true.
And you're reaching for a model of mind that can accommodate science and our subjective experience. And I really resonate to that because I was very much drawn to humanistic psychology and the human potential movement back in the day. And I think that was largely because there was a sense that scientific psychology had kind of thrown out the baby with the bath, and no attention was given to our subjective lives.
Exactly.
Honor this book.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the comments that was made by one of the reviewers, which wasn't so supportive, said, well, Siegel is saying that subjective experience is important. And didn't neurobiology prove that subjective experience doesn't exist?
Really? I wasn't aware of that.
This was so beautiful to see in a review because I knew when I wrote this book, and thank you for saying it was brave, it certainly created a lot of anxiety in me once I turned the manuscript in because, I think people have been saying, not just since 1890 with William James, but even since Hippocrates 2,500 years ago, that somehow mind was something reducible to the brain. It's an extremely common view that mind is what brain does. And so the book is full of questions just to say, well, maybe that's a part of the story, but maybe the story is actually bigger than that. And maybe the whole story is worth trying to explore.
Yeah. One of the things that you start with is noting that there is no consensus definition of mind. We all sort of think we know what we're referring to, but there's no sort of consensus scientific definition of mind. And you set out to remedy that. Why is it important to have a definition if we all sort of know what we're talking about, right?
Exactly. Well, first of all, the issue that's so intriguing is that you have this way in which you are simply using a word that has no definition, right? So that you are saying, oh, it's on my mind, or his mind did that, or her mind did that, and, or I've lost my mind, all these kinds of things. So when I entered the field of mental health, I thought for sure there'd be some definition of mind that maybe each field like psychology or social work or psychiatry or nursing or educational therapy, these fields would likely each have their own definition of mind. But what was fascinating was that actually no one had a definition of mind. So it isn't even that there's no consensus definition. There's literally no definition. Even the field of the philosophy of mind says you shouldn't define the mind. So the first thing to say is that we have a field of mind sciences and mental health that actually don't define what they're doing. So that's kind of intriguing.
Yeah, it is.
The next thing then to say is, well, if we use the word, what do we mean by it? Well, of course we mean feelings and thoughts and memories and hopes and dreams and subjective experience. The way we know we have subjective experience is consciousness. It's information processing even outside of consciousness. So we know what we mean as descriptions of the contents of mind, but why do we have a term for all those things? And some languages like French and Hebrew don't have a word mind. But many of the languages do. So we say, well, okay, well, what is it? So, I mean, I can give away, it's kind of like a, spoiler alert if someone doesn't want to hear the definition, but I offer a definition of the mind that I offered back in 1992 to a group of 40 scientists, where it was the beginning of the decade of the brain. We asked one question: what is the connection between mind and brain? And there were anthropologists and sociologists and linguists in the room who did not accept the view that the neuroscientists in the room said, which is mind is simply brain activity. And they would say, no way. We study mental processes like communication, thinking, and memory that get passed within relationships. So it isn't just the brain. Now, they weren't interested in the brain at the time, and the brain people weren't interested in, our cultures and our communities. But for me, I was kind of inviting all these people to the party. I had to come up with some working definition, at least, that could make the relationality of anthropologists and sociologists and linguists fit with the neural processes, let's say, of a neuroscientist. How could there be one process called mind that was both within us in terms of the brain and between us? And that's what the whole book is about, is the journey to explore that and see if this definition of mind that I offered back then has any validity.
Right. As you point out, the closest that we had for a consensus of mind was that mind is what the brain does. But that was inadequate, as you just explained. And, I think a lot of people give lip service, if you will, to being interdisciplinary. But you really decided to go whole hog, and you called together, 40 of your closest scientific friends from across a wide swath of approaches. You mentioned anthropology and neuroscience and linguistics and physics and mathematics and so on.
That's right.
And you met regularly, starting 10 years ago? Or?
Well, 1992. I don't even want to think how long ago that is, but I think it's 24 years.
And are you guys still meeting?
No. For lots of logistical reasons, the group, after the first few meetings, I thought the group was going to just dissolve. But with this definition of mind, we went on to meet for 4.5 years. So into the middle of the 90s.
And that's extraordinary. I mean, when you think of busy professionals, and they were willing to get together on some regular basis to discuss these topics.
It was remarkable, yeah. And it taught me the importance of respecting very different strategies for understanding reality, and they all had their strengths. And it's like the Indian fable of the blind man and the elephant, right? There is a whole elephant, but as a scientist, you study the tail or the ear or the trunk or the toe or whatever, and you're an expert in that part of the elephant. But if you take a stance, my view of the toe is the whole, well, you'll miss the fact that this elephant has a tail. So my feeling was, could there be one field that was like a whole elephant approach, that said, let's bring anthropology and sociology and linguistics and psychology and medicine in terms of psychiatry and then, biology as a whole and chemistry and physics and math. Let's bring all those fields together. And then field got called interpersonal neurobiology, meaning the inter was the between and the personal was the within. And also the idea that neurobiology was just, a hard science we could do. So the within and between, the science of the within and between, which sounds awkward. So interpersonal neurobiology was born back in 92 with this idea that maybe we could all get along, contribute each other's wise and hard-earned data points from science, from studies, and then build a new view that allowed the whole to be seen. That's the whole idea of interpersonal neurobiology. I now edit a series of books. This would be book number 51 in that.
Number 51?
This is book number 51 in the series, where a lot of different authors now contribute to it. But the idea for the field of mental health or education or parenting is how do you take interpersonal neurobiology principles, which I review in the book Mind, and see how you can apply them in your life.
Yeah. Well, you do give a lot of attention to inner and inter and how those two relate, and sort of to kind of skip ahead a bit is you make a strong case that whatever we think of as mind, or even brain, I guess, well, no, not brain, but that consciousness, let's say, extends beyond, first you say it extends beyond our skull, because
yes,
our body as a whole, we now understand that we're talking about a system, and that we can't just think that it all happens in the brain per se, but all of these systems, we've all sort of moved towards a more holistic viewpoint. But then you extend it even further past the skin. And so after 51 books, this is second nature to you. But
well, those are books I've edited. I've written.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. And help us get beyond the skin. Why should we believe that mind is something that doesn't end at the skin?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question, David. Thank you. And it's, probably the most controversial point of the approach and of the book. And it comes from, first of all, just experiential immersion. So, as a person on the planet, let me ask you, can you feel sometimes in your relationship, let's say with family members, when there's something not quite going right? Can you get that feeling?
Sure.
Yeah. So now a neuroscientist would say, well, your brain has mirror neurons and it's picking up the dis-ease of someone else and all that stuff. And that could easily be. You could have basically the brain be the whole thing. But certainly you would want to go to the whole body. But then in the room, you can feel certain things. And when I became a psychiatry resident and did group therapy, I could feel certain processes going on in very subtle ways that, yes, were emanating from the bodies of the people in the group therapy, but you could feel these processes kind of have their own texture to them. It's hard to describe. And then I started noticing when I became a researcher in attachment that you could study these patterns across many subjects. So not just my patients who I knew over many, many months, but even people I would meet in a very short time in a 90-minute interview, let's say, in my research paradigm with the adult attachment interview. And what I found there was that the narratives that were arising in the narrative interview, the adult attachment interview, had a quality that created a kind of, I call it a mind sphere, like an atmosphere in the room, whether it was trauma or shame or things I could feel inside of me that sometimes would happen even before a person would say something. I start getting images in my own mind about something that may have happened to them, and then a minute later, they'd say something very specific that was that exact image I had. And then I started asking people. Now I ask a lot of people. I've asked now hundreds and hundreds, in fact, thousands of people, have you ever, and I'll ask you, have you ever had an experience where you got some sense of something very specific happening with a person close to you, that when you later on found out that thing was happening, a thought, an event, its specificity gave you the feeling like this really could not have happened by coincidence. Have you ever had that experience?
Oh, sure. I've had runs of synchronicities that were mind-blowing at different periods of my life that, I can't account for in any scientific way, but they were way too convincing to me at a subjective level to account for, other than to say there's more going on than we're aware of.
Exactly.
We know we're being impacted by particles and so on from remote parts of the universe. So,
well, right. So if you stay with the mind side of that, just in terms of person-to-person connection, I would say about 95% of people raise their hand to the question I just asked you. And, I was teaching recently at the Royal Institute of Britain, and in that structure in London, they have the Michael Faraday Museum. And remember that Michael Faraday was a scientist in the 1800s who postulated that there were these things that you could not see, but they were real, called electromagnetic waves. Now, I'm sure his colleagues thought he was nuts because you couldn't see them, so how could they be real?
Yeah.
But now, basically, all of our electronic instruments, like our phones and stuff like that, are based on Faraday's fields. So the idea that there could be a social field is something that Peter Senge and Otto Schirmer talk about. And when they talk about something called generative fields, what we're talking about is, can you postulate, and this is why I wrote the book as carefully as I did in terms of making it questions, so not throwing absolute answers to the reader, but saying, let's go on this journey together. Let's look at these processes. And, if the mind is, let's say, a product of the brain, let's just stay with that only. Let's say Hippocrates was right. And, basically everyone who followed in science, who agreed with him, including William James, let's say they're correct. Ultimately, if you say, well, how does subjective experience emanate from brain processes? Brain processes are simply energy patterns, electrochemical energy transformations. Some of them have symbolic value, so we call it information. So even if you stay in the head, you say, okay, even if Hippocrates was right, that it's only the brain, you have this link between mental experience, part of it is subjectivity and consciousness, and electrochemical energy flow. So then it's reasonable to stay with Hippocrates and say, well, okay, so then somehow mind is an emergent property of energy flow. Well, once you say that, which to me is the only scientifically logical way of pursuing Hippocrates' view and William James's view, and the 99% of scientists in academia who say that, fine. Then once you go there, then you say, well, hold on. Energy flow is not limited by the skull, is it? You go, well, no.
No.
So if mind comes from energy flow, well, hold on. Why are you limiting it to the head? It's the whole body. And this is where, if you think about it, your experiences of synchronicity, mine, 95% of people, when I ask a room of 1,000 people, you see, 950 people's hands go up. It's remarkable. But here's what you can say. If mind is an emergent property of energy flow, why would it, or how could it be limited to the skull? Because energy flow isn't constrained by skull or skin even. So this is where you say, well, okay, then if it's the between, do we have data for that? And that's where I explore this in the book, is that I think we do have a lot of emerging data that, for example, allow you to say relationships between people are energy and information flow patterns. Like right now between you and me, and between the two of us and everyone listening. That literally is energy and information flow. It's not some weird and mystical, magical thing. It's literally air molecules moving in a pattern that we call language, right? In language we can hear with our ears, or if we were reading a transcript, you read it with the photons of your eyes. So I want to be really clear. One of the pushbacks on these concepts in the book has been that talking about the mind should never evoke the word energy. And I say to these people, why do you say that? They say, because this is what they say, energy is not a scientific concept. And so, no, don't talk about energy. So with my interns and I, who helped me do the background research for this book and other books, we have never found anyone who writes about energy and information patterns that are both embodied and relational. No one talks like that. So for me, it's very lonely, but in addition to that, it's very logical. And when I ask these people, why do you say it's not scientific? Because physics is science.
Well, and physics has formulas for energy and so on.
Yeah.
Right. So that I find a little hard to understand, that criticism. You draw upon systems theory for as one of the disciplines that helps you to arrive at where you finally arrive at.
Yes.
And I think
the idea of mathematics.
Yes, and I think the idea of emergence. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about that, because it's an important concept in your thinking, and I guess in modern thinking, but emergence kind of suggests, suddenly something appears, not necessarily in a cause and effect way, but because of how systems within systems are happening.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you, David. You're pointing out the most active points of the proposal that get people agitated. So this is a great opportunity.
I'm not agitated, but I'm glad I'm
no, but you're pointing out. Here's the idea. When we grow up and go to school, we're taught to think in very linear ways. What that means is, if I raise a cup, I'm going to pour the water out, it'll go down. And I know the raising of the cup and the turning of it led to the water going down. That's linear thinking. That is, A led to B, led to C. That's what I mean by linear.
Sure.
So we're very used to thinking in linear terms. It's you get in your car, you turn the key, you press on the gas pedal or the electric pedal, in my case, my electric car, and boom. And boy, electric cars have amazing torque. So you just go so fast, like being a kid in a little car you had when you were, you're inside of a regular car. Anyway, so these things are linear things. They're causal. That is, A led to B, led to C, led to D. So that's why we call it linear. Okay, fine. We live in a world like that, where we're taught about that, we live it, our bodies function that way. But here's the issue that is challenging with the idea of emergence, is that when you think in not linear terms, but in systems terms, a system that has three qualities: it's open influences from outside of itself, like a cloud; it's capable of being chaotic, like the air molecules and water molecules in a cloud; and it's what's called nonlinear, which means small inputs lead to large and very difficult, at least on the surface, very difficult to predict outcomes. Okay. So this system is called a complex system. Now, to understand complex systems, if you apply your linear thinking, you'll be baffled, you'll be irritated, you'll get extremely annoyed, and if someone writes a book about it, you'll probably write something like, oh, he's talking about emergence, like it's some kind of weird mystical thing. But if you get comfortable with the mathematics of nonlinearity, which I try to do very gradually and gently in the book to let a reader not familiar or comfortable with math feel the excitement of it, what you find is this. If you look in the sky at a cloud is a complex system. A system is something made up of elements. In the cloud's case, it's water and air molecules. In the case of the mind, we're saying the mind is part of a complex system of what? Energy and information flow that's both in your head and your whole body. And it's not only within you, it's between you. That's the proposal. So just like a cloud is the fundamental elements are air molecules and water molecules, a mind, the fundamental elements are energy and the subset of energy that is symbolic value called information, and how these energy information patterns flow or change. Okay, fine. So I want to compare these two systems. When you go out in the sky and you see a cloud having these beautiful shapes that are constantly emerging from the individual parts, nothing is a programmer. Nothing is Bill Gates, the cloud formation programmer that's up there having an app to do that. No, it is a complex system that has emergent properties. And in this case, one of the emergent properties, emergent just means the interaction of the elements of the system gives rise naturally to something. In this case, the particular something is called self-organization. Now, self-organization is this amazing emergent property of complex systems proven in the universe, not a hypothesis, not some cute California term, but a solid, scientifically proven property of complex systems. In this case, it's a process called self-organization. Because it's emergent, it means the interaction of the elements of the water molecules and air molecules give rise to a shape, but it turns back and it regulates the very place from which it arose. So it's counterintuitive. Emergence is counterintuitive. Self-organization is counterintuitive. A lot of people throw up their arms. They go, it doesn't make sense because they're using linear thinking, and we can respect that. But the universe is not comprised only of linearity. So with nonlinear thinking, you go, I see, if the mind is the self-organizing, emergent, embodied, and relational process that is regulating energy and information flow, that's the proposal from 1992, 24 years ago, then what you say is, how do you optimize self-organization? And then you come up with some amazing scientifically proven findings of self-organization and scientifically testable hypotheses. Optimal self-organization creates this fluid or flexible, adaptive, coherent means it's resilient over time, energizes stable flow. That spells FACES, flexible, adaptive, coherent, energizes stable, is this flow that goes between chaos on one side and rigidity on the other. So amazingly, those qualities are the best description for me I've ever seen of mental health. And it comes from optimal self-organization. And every disorder of the mind can be seen as symptoms of chaos or rigidity. So that's interesting. So then you can ask the question, and this gets back to your original question, why should we define the mind? Defining the mind allows you to say what it is, and no one is saying that. And number two, it allows you to say, what is a healthy mind? And a healthy mind would be a mind, in this definition, that is optimizing self-organization. So then you say, well, how do you do that? Very, very simple scientific finding. You differentiate elements of the cloud and you link them. You differentiate elements of your relationship and you link with compassionate communication. Or you differentiate different parts of the body, including the brain, and you link them. So let's just name that. Science, math doesn't have a name for that. We're going to name it integration. Integration we're defining as the differentiation of parts of a system and their linkage. And then the proposal is that optimal self-organization, science tells us, comes from integration. Therefore, here's our proposal, a healthy mind is a mind that creates integration between and integration within. And when you don't do that, you get chaos or rigidity. And that was the proposal from 1992. And now there's a ton of science, 24 years later, to support that proposal. I wouldn't say prove it at all, but every disorder that's ever been studied has impaired integration of the brain. Every disorder has its symptoms as chaos or rigidity. And now a study in 2015 from the Human Connectome Project showed every measure of well-being they could determine was best predicted by how integrated the brain was, how interconnected the connectome is, which is how the differentiated regions of the brain are linked.
Wait, you covered a lot of ground there.
Yeah, that's to say why it's important to give a definition of the mind. I'm not just a definition nut. Without a definition of mind, you can't say what a healthy mind is.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you go from where you started out all the way, finally bridging to psychiatry, psychotherapy, personal
education, parenting, and climate change issues.
Yeah, but what was that thing that you just referenced? You said the something project.
Oh, it's the International Human Connectome Project, CONNECT, Connect, and then OME, OME. What that is we as a human species have developed new capacities technologically to look at very subtle differentiated areas in the brain and show their linkages. We couldn't do this before. And that's called the Connectome Project. And
is that a neuroscience project, or who's?
Yeah, it's a neuroscience project. And, you know, one of our, we have a big, what's called internet education program. One of our students called us up and said, "Oh my God, I'm here at the Institute. Did you see this study? We hadn't seen it yet." She sent it to us, the link. And there it was. The best predictor of well-being is how interconnected the connectome is in every measure of well-being they could find, and every way of measuring the brain. Essentially, the best predictor of health is how integrated your brain is.
So if somebody wanted to look this up, what would they?
October 2015, the Human Connectome Project. I mean, the reference is in the Mind book. I don't remember the first author, but if you just put in International Human Connectome Project, October 2015, you'll find it.
Okay. So a few reflections that come to mind. First of all, the idea of emergence. It seems to me that's a property of life, perhaps, particularly the self-organizing.
Yeah.
It seems like life is a good example of that, just life. And
that's true.
And the emergence, the universe, the big universe. And we've struggled so long. Well, you know, what causes that? Where did that come from? And, you know, maybe emergence is the closest that we can come to it. It just emerged.
Well, it's really fascinating, you know, by the end of the book, you know, because the book is done in part with the interrogatives, you know, who are we?
Yeah.
What are we? How does the mind work in wellness and unwellness? You know, where is the mind within and between? And then it gets to two questions that I never thought in my life I'd be having discussions with people about or writing about or anything like that. But it's like, when are we? And why are we? So with the when question, one of the startling things in my own journey to write the book was to make sure that I dove as deeply into the contemporary discussions, mostly from physics and math, of time. And it became clear that for some of these writers, some of these academicians, the idea of time as something that flows is not true. So we say, oh, time is flying by, or I don't have enough time, all this kind of stuff. So I talk a lot about this in the book, but the bottom line of it is there is a directionality of change. That is, if you and I were cracking an egg open, David, we couldn't uncrack it. So there's a directionality that things change, but there's nothing that's flowing called time. I mean, we name probably the awareness of change is what we call time. So I use the word time, but I define it as awareness of change, not something that flows. Now, the arrow of time is a scientific term for the directionality of change. And interestingly, it only exists in what's called the Newtonian classical physics state. These are macro states, where the egg is an accumulation of lots of molecules, which, by the way, are accumulations of very condensed energy. And this collection called an egg is a macro state. Now, macro states operate by the principle of Newtonian classical physics. And in that level of reality, like driving a car or flying an airplane, you do have an arrow of time. You have a directionality of change. You can't uncrack the egg. Those are macro states.
Right.
But what I talk about in the mind discussion, I'll ask you, David, in your own personal experience, have you ever noticed that some parts of what you're aware of, yes, have a sense that things keep on changing and can't be brought back, and they're kind of there's a directionality to them. But in other states, you have what we would call timelessness, or things just are just seem without the boundaries of what we call time. Do you have that experience?
Well, I'm not sure. I think one place where I have it is, and this probably comes from meditative experiences, the sense of the observing witness, if you will, that part of my consciousness that feels relatively unchanging.
And does that have a timelessness to it?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Well, what happened for me is since I was 11, I always noticed there were like these two very distinct qualities of mental life. One was the more common one, which was things are always changing, can't get them back. And there would be an existential angst about it, like, oh my God, life is going to go on. I'll end and die, and this is the end of it. But then there was another state I would get into, walking in nature or, reflecting on things, that now I have a practice called the wheel of awareness that I do, where the hub of the wheel is the knowing of consciousness, and the rim of this wheel is the metaphoric place of putting the knowns. And the knowns would have this quality of an arrow of time. Things are always changing and unfolding, and you can get it back. But in the hub, I would get this sense of eternity, this sense of timelessness, this sense that things were not just in a river that was flowing. And, in the book, what I talk about is the possibility, when you look at what the mind is as an emergent property of energy, that you can make a proposal. We can talk about it now or later if you want, but the bottom line is the mind may have macro states it experiences, like a thought or a memory, something like that, that have an arrow of time, a directionality of change, but that consciousness itself, awareness itself, the receptive state of knowing that we call awareness, may actually be a micro state. And in that micro state, what's that?
Like going into quantum physics?
Yeah, well, and when you look at the quantum level of things, deals with microstates like an electron. Microstates have no arrow of time. They have no directionality of change. So this, for me, was such a revelation in looking at the science, because it helped me understand what I'd been struggling with since I was 11, that I could have both this directionality of change called an arrow of time, but also have no directionality of change, it's timelessness. And I could never make sense of it. In the book, in the when part, it really goes into that, like, wow. So if the mind is an emergent property of energy, then energy is thought of as the movement from possibility to actuality through a series of probabilities. This is called a probability distribution curve. And I finished a study of 10,000 individuals that I published in the book. You'll read the findings, where when they go to this hub, it's almost like they're dropping down to the zero or near zero position of this probability distribution curve, which is this sea of potential is what physicists call it. And the proposal that seems to naturally arise from this study is that awareness itself may be when energy in the probability curve position has moved to this open plane. And in doing so, it's achieved a microstate condition. That is, infinity is infinity, this one state of infinity, openness like that. So it's a really interesting thing. And then, in the part that gets to the why, what happens from an existential point of view in the book is really wrestling with this idea of like, wow, there may be a reason we're here, and how we can kind of rest in a more comfortable place about this view of time, the when of mind. And when you look at the why of mind, you get into the idea that if we are self-organizing emergent processes, the why of mind is to allow integration to be free to naturally arise, which ultimately is about being kind and compassionate. And within us, it's about self-understanding and the capacity to have this deep connection with our authentic experience as it's happening.
Well, I wonder if some people might be suspicious that you end up in a place, that all the great spiritual traditions have advocated, of things like kindness and gratitude, and what were some of the others you mentioned? These
compassion, yeah.
Compassion, yes.
When you say suspicious of what?
I'm not saying I'm suspicious, although there's enough suspiciousness, I guess, for this thought to occur to me, that you start off in this science realm and then you end up in what one would have to say is a spiritual realm.
Well, it's really interesting, David, that you're raising all these incredible points, but for me, what's been fascinating is to try to stay, I'm trained as a scientist, and these are fundamental science principles. So the first book I wrote, The Developing Mind, was just summarizing the science. This one extends the summary into more, more proposals than any book I've ever written. But here's the idea. I have no background in spirituality, training as a youth or an adolescent, none basically. I have been trained as a clinician, so moving from pure science training, which I started at, to being a clinician was itself kind of a move to more about connection rather than intellectual comprehension. And those connections had and have a deep sense of meaning and purpose. And as I went forward, ultimately as a clinician and scientist and became an educator, those three things, I would be out in the world doing workshops and people would come to me from different traditions. Like I was once in northern Alaska and the head of the Inuit tribes came to me and she said, everything you've been talking about are what we've been teaching through the oral tradition for 5,000 years. And then I would teach somewhere else and someone from the Buddhist tradition would say, for 2,600 years, this is what the Buddhist tradition is. Or I would teach in the Midwest of the United States, the Lakota tradition, or I would be teaching in the South Pacific, and people from the Polynesian tradition would say, this is what we've been teaching for thousands of years. So for me, it was like, as a scientist, clinician, educator, it was like, wow. And then the strange thing that happened was, this is, I think, why I had to write the book in the way I did, these epochs of time. The strange thing that happened is I started getting these invitations to speak at spirituality and education conference, spirituality and science conferences. And I had no background in spirituality. So I would say, I think you've made a mistake. I don't know anything about spirituality, zero. And in fact, I was kind of raised not to even use that word, which is true, So then I asked people in a workshop I was in, what is spirituality? And they said, oh, and they went around the room and everyone said the same thing. It's meaning beyond survival and connection beyond a separate self. And I said, is that what spirituality is, meaning and connection? They go, yeah, that's basically it. I said, oh my God, sign me up. And so when you say just now, oh, you've moved from science to spirituality, I find if it's about meaning and connection, that's exactly what the mind journey has been all about, is to find about meaning and connection. And, just a few months ago, Tammy Simon introduced me as the only scientist there speaking at the Eckhart Tolle event on, I forgot what the formal thing was, Living a Life of Presence. I think we put this up on our website so you can watch it, this 2 and 3/4 hour journey. And Tammy gets up there, runs Sounds True, about spiritual wisdom. And she says, well, we need someone to bridge the field of science and spirituality. So we asked Dan to come do it. And I was very nervous because, Eckhart Tolle had all these spiritual teachers there. And I was the only science person. And it was like, wow, first of all, they're going to put everybody to sleep. And just because it'd be so boring. And secondly, what a task, to try to make this bridge. But you'll see how it unfolds. There were 1,000 people in the room, and you'll get a feeling. I think you can feel the texture of the joining that happened. Yeah. So for me, I feel like this interpersonal neurobiology approach does dissolve the boundaries between the field of science and the field of spirituality in ways that I never even thought could be done or should be done, or I never had the intention of that happening. But it seems to have happened.
Yeah, yeah. I'm struck by the fact that you've referenced 11 years old, and my memory is not very good. I can't tell you anything about when I was 11. What is it that you experienced at 11 that still stays with you and is so? It seems to be really important for this.
Yeah, there was a moment right before I was turning 12. Actually, I remember I remember the specific moment when I was with my friend Tommy, and we were cleaning out a pup tent my father had from the military, and cleaning it out, and getting it ready to go taking it on this camping trip we're going with this group of, teenagers. We're in this summer camp, And I said to Tom, I'm friends with him now and I call him Tom anyway. Back then he was Tommy. I said to Tommy, look, we're going to clean out this tent now. And, just like that, we're going to be up in the sequoias in this tent with our sleeping bags, just enjoying the delicious smell of the pine trees. He goes, oh yeah, it's going to be great. And I remember looking at him going, but just like that, we're going to be back here cleaning out the tent again and folding it up. So the next summer when we go camping again, we're going to have it ready to go. He goes, oh, that's going to be great. I said, and just like that, we'll probably be in high school and maybe we'll go camping as high school students. He goes, yeah, that's great. And I said, and like that, maybe we'll get married and we'll go out with our families like that. He goes, okay, that's great. That's great. And I go, and just like that, we're going to be dead. I
have had that same experience.
There you go.
I've used the same metaphor in relation to death. I mean,
and how did it make you feel?
Maybe 11. I was thinking about death and trying to grasp it, and had this sense that, that it would be like this when I look back.
Well, exactly. So that's the feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And I never stopped thinking about it every day of my life since then, before I turned 12, so 11. And, for me, what's so strange about this mind book is that writing this book, having to articulate all these things, changed my relationship for the first time, really, with death.
How so?
Well, when I dove deeply into the why of mind, it gave me a certain peacefulness that, all we can do is try to release this natural push for integration. That's it sort of took away an existential angst about like, why are we here? But then the existential angst of, oh my God, we're not here for a limited time. When I dove into the time part of the when of mind, there was this incredible peacefulness that came, I don't even know, I feel it, where if you think about it this way, and I have a friend named John O'Donohue whose body died, almost 10 years ago now. And John and I, he was a former Catholic priest and a poet and a mystic, but he and I were writing a book together and never got finished, but we were teaching a lot together. And one of the things we've talked about would be death. And I said to John, and this is what I'll say to you, David, and this is what I talk about in the book, is there's some way of thinking about it where, think about an ant that walks on a ruler from inch 3 to 4, and then this little ant walks from inch 4 to 5, and then the little ant walks to inch 6. Well, from the ant's perspective, once this ant is at inch 6, all the other inches have disappeared, right? The only thing that exists for that little ant is inch 6. So I said to John, and I'll say to you, David, what if what we call time is actually like a ruler, that we get about 100, what we call years, 100 inches, if you will, to live on this ruler of life. And that from our ant-like perspective, here we are, in the date that it is today, and we think everything that happened before has disappeared. I said, but it is very possible that actually this space-time stuff is actually more like a ruler, and that we're crawling along this block universe is sometimes what it's called. And so, of course, in these bodies, we have the perspective that we're only at inch 6 and that's the only thing that exists. But the fact is, whatever you've ever had, people you've loved, discoveries you've made about the meaning of life, connections you've established, that can never be taken away. Now you can say, oh, he's just rationalizing, but I can tell you from, even if it is rationalization, the feeling I have from the science is that life may be more like that, and we have this very strange reality that John and I would talk about in a certain way, and I wish I could have him on with us right now and he'd join us in the conversation, that we're born into a Newtonian classical body, but we have a mind that both has these macro state thoughts, but this microstate consciousness that lives at the quantum level. So that in viewing things that way, there's just this incredible peacefulness that comes to me. And I've said this in other, settings. I didn't put this in the book, but I'll just tell you here, David, the most direct issue about death that came to me was my father died about 4 years ago now, 4.5 years ago. And when he was dying, he was a strict mechanical engineer, science guy, never spoke about anything related to anything beyond these mechanical engineering ideas he had. But when he was getting near death and he asked me what's going on, was he dying? And I looked at his vital signs and said he was very sick. And I said, yeah, Dad, you're getting close to dying. He goes, what's going to happen to me? And I said, I don't know. And I don't know if anyone knows. He goes, well, what do you think? I said, well, I have my thoughts, but I don't know if they're right, but I'll share them with you if you want. He goes, yeah, what do you think? I said, there was this time when you didn't exist. And I've never had any patient come to me worried about where they were before they were conceived,
Yeah, I've thought about that. Yeah.
Right? So I said, you come from a sea of potential. And you're born into a body because there's one sperm and one egg of the infinite numbers of combinations. They made the wonderful you that you are. And, you had this time, about 100 years in a body. But it may be that this movement from the sea of potential into these actualities that we call our life in the body is simply, as the body dies, going to melt back into the sea of potential where you were before you were conceived. I was holding his hand, and he looked into my eyes, and he got this beautiful, peaceful smile on his face. He said, that makes me feel so peaceful.
Oh, that's great.
And it was the last conversation I ever had with my dad.
Yeah. Wow.
He died right after that. And, I guess for me, it wasn't just something I was saying to him. Who knows if it's right or not? I have a feeling it might be right. The feeling inside of me is just a shift in how I approach the idea that we're here in these bodies, So anyway, I think it's part of why I wrote the book Mind, was to say to the reader, look, come with me on this journey. Let's see how it connects to your own experience, because in the book I'm constantly asking people to reflect on their own experience, not just take what I say as my experience as something that is valid for them, but in doing the joining and through questions, what people who've read the book have shared with me is that it really does transform your sense of what it's like to be a person on the planet. So that's been incredibly rewarding to get responses from people.
It's been 5 years, but I sense a difference in you in the conversation that we're having now.
Really? What do you sense?
You seem to me maybe more present, more, just the level of experience that you're sharing, I think, is a difference. I think maybe I find you more relatable. Not that you weren't relatable then, but I don't know. There's something here that to me feels gives evidence to what you've been talking about in terms of feeling like your life has been impacted and changed. And I'm particularly interested in this meditative, you call it a reflective practice of the wheel of awareness.
Yeah.
And you've done research on that. You say you've got it online or something, and you've gathered data from 10,000 people.
Well, we have it online. We give it away, and we've had close to 1 million people download it. But the 10,000 person study is in person in workshops. I did the wheel, recorded the results, and had people who were up for it either write down their experiences or share them through a microphone, and then we recorded them, and literally did it around the world. So I've done it in throughout North America, throughout Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, and the results are the same. A person can run a monastery in South Korea, or can never have meditated before and be a Microsoft engineer who just retired. They could be someone with a tremendous interest in therapy, or someone who just got dragged by a spouse into the workshop. And what is absolutely amazing is the results are basically universal. That is, it doesn't matter the person's background. It doesn't matter their educational experiences. It doesn't matter their profession. It doesn't matter their age. It doesn't matter the culture, religion, all these things, gender issues. I mean, so then the question was, when I finished the 10,000 person gathering of the data, you know, of those who decided to speak and those who wrote things down, it's not that everyone had these experiences, but why would the results be so universal? Because I didn't publish any of this stuff. None of it was anywhere, right, about what it might do. And what happened was, well, a number of things. One, the practice, the Wheel of Awareness practice was started in the 90s by combining two thoughts. Consciousness is needed for change. Integration is needed for well-being. What if you integrated consciousness? And then you say, well, how would you do that? Well, integration is differentiation and linkage. So consciousness is simply defined as a sense of knowing that allows you to have the knowing of a known, like a thought or what you see or what you feel in your body. So then there's a table just through this wall here that's in the shape of a wheel. Basically, it's got a central hub and an outer rim. And I would say, okay, let's put the knowing in the hub and the known on the rim, and let's have this thing that holds up the table. It's like a stand thing. Let's call that a spoke of attention and move it around metaphorically. So they would differentiate the different knowns, like seeing from hearing, from smelling, from tasting, from touching. That's one segment of the rim. Then the interior of the body, you know, muscles, bones, organs. Then we go to feelings and thoughts and memories and mental activities like that in the third segment of the rim. And then we go to a fourth segment is our relational sense, our sense of connection to other people on the planet. And then I added a more advanced step, which was to bend the spoke of attention around and aim it right back into the hub. And there's a lot to say about the whole thing, and I report the results in the book Mind. That's the first place it's reported. And so you'll see, that's where it's published, you'll see what the results were, but the bottom line is, when people, for example, would turn the spoke of attention around into the hub or withdraw the spoke of attention into the hub, they would experience this expansiveness. Many people would experience this dissolution of a sense of time. So they'd feel eternity, they'd feel the infinite, the disappearance of boundaries of space. Some people would say they felt God, felt love, felt safe, felt incredible peacefulness, joy, elation, this sense of connection to things that they never felt connected to before. And I put the quotes in the book. So then the issue is, you know, from a scientific point of view, you know, what could that be? And I talk about if you see the mind as an emergent property of energy flow means change. One way of viewing energy flow is a movement along this probability distribution curve we talked about. So that's where the idea, the proposal comes from, the idea that consciousness, the knowing, receptive awareness of consciousness, maybe when energy is in this plane of possibility, and if that's true, then your plane, David, and my plane, and everyone listening on this program's plane, our planes are all the same. We become differentiated in what are called plateaus and peaks, and that's fine. We want to honor differences, but realize that when we drop into this plane, which I do the wheel every day, I get that deep experience, you do get this feeling of profound presence, profound openness. You start seeing other people as simply really manifestations of your same essence. That is, there's a word I use called mui. You know, there's the me in the body, there's the we in our connection, and identity can have this integrated quality of a mui. And
it's spelled MWE.
MWE, yeah. And
right.
You know, what's amazing is I go around to different workshops and different schools and different parenting programs, and I say, look, part of the issue I think we're struggling with in modern society is we've placed the mind in the head, which may be just part of a much bigger story. And if the self comes from the mind, that means the mind comes from your head, or at least from your body, and that means you're a solo self. That may be part of the truth as a me, but we have a larger we, and I'm working with some people from South Africa who work with this thing called Ubuntu. Anyway, there's a whole way of looking at other cultures that may be embracing this better than we do in modern society, but here's the bottom line. a separate self, mind coming from brain alone, self coming from mind. The separate self may be a lie, and it may be a lie that is lethal. And so part of what drives me so much in terms of my educational efforts these days is to work with people in organizations, people in government, people in parenting programs, people in schools, individuals, to say, look, we've been living a lie that's killing us. It's killing our planet, because when you're separate, you treat Earth like a trash can. And when you're separate, you don't have meaning and connection. So what people call spiritual is really deeply, from an interpersonal neurobiology point of view, it's really about integration. Can you be truly integrated in your life and realize that your life, that phrase, is not limited to the life of your body?
Wow, you've come from the science and you've gone all the way around the circle, and you are in this, coming to these kind of spiritual truths and insights. Is there a website where people can go to find out how to do this?
Absolutely.
Awareness?
Yeah. So the website is Dr. Dan, D-A-N, Siegel, S-I-E-G-E-L. So DRDANSIEGEL.com. Go to the resources tab, and you'll see a number of wheels. There's the beginning wheel, intermediate wheel, and advanced wheel. So depending on your background and how comfortable you feel, you could do a breath awareness training for a little while to stabilize your attention, and then dive into the wheel. You know, it's something you can try and just give it a go and see how you feel doing it.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Dan, I think that we have covered a lot of the essence in your book. And of course, there's a lot more detail there than we were able to get at. But I want to thank you for being my guest again today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you, David. It's been an honor, and I look forward to connecting with you more in the future.